I was sitting by the window of a small train from Kolkata to Dhaka when I first felt it. The strange feeling that I was crossing something invisible. The train was old and slow, and the sound of the wheels made me sleepy. But inside me, there was a quiet storm. My mother was born in this city, and I had grown up listening to her stories. She often said that home was where your heart remembered peace. I used to believe her, but now as the train crossed the border, I was not sure which place my heart remembered anymore. When I was a child, my mother spoke about Dhaka as if it was a dream. She told me about mango trees that bent low with fruit, about her father's garden full of laughter, and about the small white house near a river where she spent her school days. I used to close my eyes and imagine it all, even though I had never seen it. For many years, the city felt closer to me than the one I actually lived in. But as I grew older, her stories began to feel more like history than memory. I started to wonder if those places even existed anymore, or if they were only in her mind. When she passed away 2 years ago, she left me a small wooden box with her name carved inside. There were a few old letters, one photograph, and a map with a red mark. She never told me what it meant, but after her death, I could not stop thinking about it. So I decided to go there myself. I wanted to see the place that shaped her life. I wanted to know if it could tell me something about mine. As the train stopped at the border, officers came in to check passports. I watched people waiting quietly, holding their documents as if they were holding their lives. Some smiled nervously, some looked tired, and some seemed too old to travel at all. It was strange how one piece of paper could decide who you were and where you belonged. I thought of my mother again and wondered if she would have been allowed to cross back. When the train started moving again, I looked out of the window. The land looked almost the same as before. The fields stretched wide, the same sun touched the trees, and the wind smelled the same. There was no sign that I had entered another country, yet something inside me had changed. I felt as if I had crossed an invisible wall. Maybe that was what my mother meant when she spoke about the shadow lines, the lines that we cannot see but still divide us. When I reached Dhaka, the air was warm and heavy. The city was alive with sounds, buses honking, people shouting, children laughing. I took a small taxi to the address written on the back of one of my mother's letters. The street was narrow and filled with old buildings. My heart beat fast as the taxi stopped in front of a white gate. It was almost the same as my mother had described. For a moment, I thought I could see her standing there. I met an old man outside the gate. He was watering some plants and looked up when I greeted him. I told him my mother's name, and his face softened. He said he remembered a young girl who used to run around the garden many years ago. He said her laughter was like music. I smiled because that sounded like her. He invited me inside. The house was smaller than I had imagined, but full of life. There were photographs on the walls and the smell of jasmine in the air. I felt like I had stepped into a piece of time that refused to end. Before we continue, I would love to know something. Where are you listening from today? Which city or country feels like home to you? Tell me in the comments. And if you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel for more stories every week. The old man told me his name was Rahim. He said his father and my grandfather had been close friends before the war separated their families. I did not know much about that time. My mother never spoke about the war in detail. She only said that one day everything changed and they had to leave. Rahim showed me an old photograph. In it, there were two men standing near a river, smiling. One of them was my grandfather. They looked young and full of hope. I wondered how long that hope lasted before the border tore it apart. That evening, Rahim made tea and asked me about my life in India. I told him I was a teacher in Kolkata and that I had grown up hearing stories about this house. He listened carefully and nodded. Then he said something that stayed with me. He said, "Borders cannot stop memories. They can only make them harder to carry." I understood what he meant. I had carried my mother's memories all my life, but I had never known how heavy they were until that moment. I asked him about the map my mother left. He smiled and said he might know what it meant. He took me to a small room at the back of the house. There was a wooden chest covered in dust. Inside, there were some books, old letters, and a small piece of jewelry shaped like a bird. It was silver and had a small red stone for an eye. I remembered seeing it once when I was a child. My mother used to wear it during festivals. I held it in my hand and felt a wave of emotion. It was like touching her again. Rahim said his mother gave that bird to my mother before they left. It was meant to keep her safe. I wanted to ask why they never met again, but I could see pain in his eyes, so I stayed quiet. Instead, I asked if he would show me the river from the photograph. He agreed and said we could go in the morning. That night, I could not sleep. I lay on the small bed in the guest room, listening to the city sounds outside. Somewhere in the distance, a train was passing. It reminded me of my journey and how far I had come. I thought about all the people who had crossed borders, not only on maps but also inside themselves. My mother, Rahim's family, even me, maybe we all, lived between places, between memories and hopes, between who we were and who we wanted to be. When morning came, the sky was soft with early light. Rahim took me down a narrow path behind the house. After a short walk, we reached the river. The water moved slowly, shining like glass. I felt a strange calmness standing there. Rahim said this was where the photograph was taken. He pointed to a big tree on the other side and said that was where his family used to have picnics before everything changed. I tried to imagine it, the laughter, the food, the stories, but all I could hear was the quiet sound of water. I took out my mother's photograph and held it next to the view. The faces matched the place perfectly. I could almost hear their voices in the wind. I suddenly realized that I was crying. Rahim did not say anything. He simply stood beside me, and that silence said everything. As we walked back, he said he was glad I came. He said people forget too easily, and when we forget, we lose the bridge that connects us. I looked at him and said that maybe a remembering is the only way to go home. He smiled and said, "Yes, even when the home no longer exists." When I returned to the house, I looked once more at the silver bird in my hand. I decided I would not take it back with me. It belonged here, in the place where the story began. I left it on the table near the photograph of my grandfather and Rahim's father. I felt lighter as I walked out. For the first time, I did not feel like a visitor. I felt like a part of something larger, something that did not need borders or passports. As I stepped outside, the sunlight touched the white gate again, and I thought about how easily lines can fade when you stop believing in them. Maybe that was what my mother wanted me to understand all along. The lines were never real. The people, the memories, the love, that was what stayed. Before I continue with the story, Please like, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you are listening from. Your support means a lot. Now, let's continue. When I woke up the next morning, the house was quiet. Rahim had gone to the market, and I sat near the window with a notebook in my hand. I wanted to write down everything that had happened since I arrived. The light came through the curtains softly, and I could hear birds outside. It was peaceful. I began to write about my mother, about her stories, and about the journey that brought me here. The words came easily at first, but then I stopped. I realized I was not only writing her story anymore, I was writing mine too. Later that day, Rahim returned with fresh bread and tea. He asked if I wanted to visit a nearby school where his daughter worked as a teacher. I said yes. We walked together through the streets. Children played with kites, and the smell of fried food came from small shops. Everything felt both familiar and new. When I reached the school, I saw children sitting on the floor, reading aloud from their books. Their voices were clear and full of energy. Rahim's daughter, Amina, smiled and introduced me to them. She asked if I could tell them a story. At first, I was shy, but then I told them about my mother's silver bird, the one with the red stone eye. I said it could fly between places that people could not cross. The children listened with wide eyes. Some smiled, and one small boy whispered that he wished he had such a bird too. Their innocence touched me. When I finished, Amina thanked me and said, "Stories travel better than people." I thought about that all the way back home. In the evening, Rahim and I sat in the garden. The air was warm, and fireflies moved between the plants. He told me about his son who lived in London. He said he missed him, but also wanted him to have a better life. I asked if his son ever came back to visit. Rahim looked at the stars and said, "Not yet. He says he will come when he feels ready." I could hear something heavy in his voice. Maybe the sun was waiting for a perfect moment that would never come. I thought about how many of us wait like that, believing time will bring us closer. But sometimes it only takes us farther away. The next morning, I went to the market alone. I wanted to see the city through my own eyes. The streets were crowded, full of color and noise. I stopped at a small shop selling old books. There, under a pile of dusty pages, I found something unexpected. It was a small notebook with my grandfather's initials on the cover. I opened it carefully. Inside, there were notes in his handwriting, short sentences about daily life, lists of names, and thoughts about the future. On one page, I found something that made my heart stop. It said, "If we ever leave, we must return. Otherwise, the house will forget us." I closed the notebook and held it close. Those words felt like a message across time. My grandfather never came back, but maybe I was the one who did it for him. I bought the notebook and went back to Rahim's house. When I showed it to him, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "The house never forgot you. It was waiting." I smiled, though my eyes filled with tears. That evening, I sat by the river again. The light on the water changed from gold to blue as the sun went down. I thought about how many people before me must have stood in the same place, thinking about home, about belonging, about the invisible lines that separate one story from another. Maybe those lines are made not of land, but of memory. The next day, I planned to leave. I told Rahim I would go back to Kolkata on the morning train. He said he understood, but hoped I would visit again. Before I left, Amina gave me a small handmade bookmark. She said it was to remind me of the stories we shared. I thanked her and promised to send books for her students. Rahim walked with me to the station. The platform was crowded. People were saying goodbye, holding hands, calling names over the noise. He looked at me and said, "When you go back, tell your people that we still remember them." His voice was soft, but I could hear the truth in it. The train started to move. I waved to him through the window until he became a small figure in the distance. As the city disappeared behind me, I felt both full and empty at the same time. I had found pieces of my mother's past, but I also found something new, something about myself. When I returned to Kolkata, the air felt different. The same roads, the same house, but I was not the same person anymore. I placed the notebook from the market on my desk and opened my mother's wooden box again. For the first time, I read her letters carefully. One of them was written to someone named R. I understood now that it was Rahim. The letter said, "If I cannot return, tell my daughter where the river meets the light." I felt a shiver. That was the exact place where Rahim had taken me. I realized he must have known all along. The next few days passed quietly. I went back to work at the school. My students asked where I had been, and I told them I went to find a story. They laughed and said they wanted to hear it. I told them about the train, the house, and the river. I told them that sometimes you travel far away, not to discover something new, but to understand what you already have. One evening, after class, I met my friend Leela at a cafe. She listened to everything and said, "Maybe the shadow lines are inside us. Maybe they move when we move." I thought about her words. It made sense. We all draw lines around ourselves between our past and present, between love and fear, between where we belong and where we wish to belong. But sometimes those lines are only in our minds. That night, I dreamed of the silver bird again. It flew over cities and rivers, carrying stories instead of people. When it landed, the places were no longer separate. They touched and became one. I woke up smiling because I finally understood. The lines my mother spoke about were never meant to divide. They were meant to remind us that connection is stronger than distance. A week later, I received a letter from Rahim. He said Amina's students still talked about my story. He also sent me a small photograph. It showed the silver bird on the table next to the picture of our grandfathers. On the back of the photograph, he had written, "The house remembers." I placed it near my mother's photo and felt a quiet peace in my heart. As days passed, I started writing a book about my journey. It was not only about borders or families, it was about remembering, about how places live inside us even when we are far away. I called it the shadow lines because that was what they were, shadows of something real but invisible, something that connects rather than separates. A few months passed after my return to Kolkata, but the journey to Dhaka never really left me. It stayed with me in quiet moments when I walked to school, when I made tea, when I looked at the morning light on the walls of my home. It was as if something invisible had followed me back, not heavy but gentle, like a whisper that said, "Remember." I often thought about Rahim and his family. Sometimes I could still hear his voice saying that memories travel better than people. It felt true. Every day, I carried those memories like small lights inside me. One Sunday morning, I received a letter from London. It was from Rahim's son, Imran. He had heard about me from his father. He said he was visiting India for a short time and wanted to meet me. I agreed. We decided to meet at a cafe near the river in Kolkata. When I arrived, I saw a young man with kind eyes sitting by the window. He stood up and smiled when he saw me. For a moment, I could see Rahim in his face. He spoke softly and said his father often told him that the past is not something behind us, but something that lives with us. Imran told me that Rahim had fallen ill a few weeks after my visit, but was recovering slowly. He said his father often sat in the garden, holding the silver bird, and told stories about the woman who came from across the border looking for her mother's home. I laughed quietly and said, "He always had a beautiful way of telling things." Imran nodded and said that his father wanted to send me something. He opened his bag and took out a small envelope. Inside it was a pressed jasmine flower and a note in Rahim's handwriting. It said, "When you smell this, remember the garden. It still blooms." I closed my eyes for a second. I could almost smell the air of Dhaka again, warm and full of life. I thanked Imran and said I hoped his father would get better soon. Before leaving, Imran said something that stayed with me. He said, "My father believes that you brought back our family's lost story. He says the house remembers because of you." I did not know what to say. Sometimes the meaning of what we do is clearer to others than to ourselves. After he left, I walked along the river for a long time. The city was busy, but I felt calm. The water moved slowly, catching pieces of sunlight. I thought about how this river and the one in Dhaka were part of the same flow, connected under the same sky. They were not separate. Maybe people were like that, too, separated by lines, but still connected by something deeper that never changes. In the following weeks, I started writing again. The book was growing slowly, like a plant that needed patience. I wrote about my mother's stories, about Rahim's garden, about the faces of the children in Amina's school. I wanted to keep their voices alive. Writing made me feel closer to them. Each sentence felt like a small bridge built across time and distance. Then one evening, while I was working, the phone rang. It was Amina. Her voice was calm but soft. She said her father had passed away peacefully in his sleep. For a few seconds, I could not speak. I felt the air around me go still. She said he had kept the silver bird near his bed, and that he had asked her to tell me, "Do not be sad. The river never ends." I thanked her quietly and promised to visit again someday. After the call, I sat by the window for a long time. The city lights reflected in my eyes, but I was seeing another light, the kind that comes from memory and love. That night, I took out Rahim's letter, my grandfather's notebook, and my mother's wooden box. I placed them side by side on the table. I realized they were all part of one story. Different people, different times, but one line of connection that ran through us. The shadow lines were not only between countries, they were between generations, between past and present, between loss and discovery. A few months later, I received an invitation from Amina. She said the school in Dhaka wanted to start a small library for the children and name it after Rahim. She asked if I could help. I agreed at once. I collected books from my school, from friends, and from my students. Everyone wanted to contribute. When the boxes were ready, I decided to travel there myself to deliver them. It felt right to return, not as a visitor this time, but as someone carrying stories back home. When I arrived in Dhaka again, Amina met me at the station. Her smile was warm, though her eyes showed the sadness of missing her father. We drove through the familiar streets until we reached the school. The children ran out to greet us. They clapped when they saw the boxes of books. It was simple, but beautiful. Inside one of the boxes, I had placed a framed photograph of Rahim and my grandfather together by the river. When Amina saw it, she pressed her hand to her heart and said, "Now both of them can watch over the stories." We arranged the books on wooden shelves. The air smelled of paint and paper. On the wall, a small sign read, "The Rahim Memorial Library, for Stories Without Borders." I stood there quietly, feeling something close to peace. I realized that the place my mother had once called home had now become part of my own life, too. I did not need to belong to one side or the other. I belonged to the bridge between them. That evening, Amina and I walked to the river again. The water moved gently under the fading light. She said she often came there to think about her father. I told her that when I first stood here, I had felt lost, but now I felt complete. We watched the sun go down without speaking. When darkness came, Sisasamamba, Samungasan said softly, "Do you think our parents can see us?" I smiled and said, "Yes, and I think they are proud." The next morning, before leaving, I went back to Rahim's house one last time. It looked quiet, as if it was resting. The garden was still full of flowers, and the smell of jasmine filled the air. I walked to the table where the silver bird had always been. It was still there, shining faintly in the light. I touched it gently and whispered, "Thank you." Then I left a small paper next to it. On it, I wrote the last line of my book. We travel to find places, but we stay to find ourselves. As I walked away from the house, I turned back once. The gate was open, and sunlight was falling on the white walls. It looked peaceful, almost like someone had just smiled. I carried that image with me all the way to the station. On the train back to Kolkata, I watched the land pass by again, the green fields, the small rivers, the same sky. But this time, the invisible border did not feel like a line. It felt like a path. When I reached home, I placed the finished pages of my book on my desk. I called it The Shadow Lines, the same name my mother had once whispered in her stories. It was her dream, but it had become mine too. I hoped that one day someone else would read it and remember that we are all part of the same story, even if the lines between us look different. I looked out of the window. The evening light was soft, and somewhere in the distance, a train was moving. I closed my eyes and felt the rhythm of its wheels. It sounded like a heartbeat, steady, endless, carrying stories from one world to another. And I thought maybe this is what it means to belong. Not to a place, but to the spaces in between. If you liked my story, please like, comment, and share.